Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Novel Approaches, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. I'm Thomas Jones, a senior editor at the paper and your host for today's conversation about The Last Chronicle of Barset by Anthony Trollope. And joining me today are Dinah Birch and Tom Crewe. Dinah Birch is an emerita professor of English literature at the University of Liverpool, and her books include Ruskin's Myths and Our Victorian Education, as well as editions of John Ruskin, George Eliot, Elizabeth Gaskell, whom she spoke about with Claire Bucknell earlier in this podcast series, and, of course, Anthony Trollope. She's written dozens of pieces for the LRB, often on Victorians, though most recently a very wonderful piece on the detective novels of P.D. James. And her latest book is Anthony Trollope, A Very Short Introduction. So hello, Dinah, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Tom Crewe is a novelist, historian, and contributing editor at the LRB. His novel, The New Life, set in late 19th century England, won the 2023 Orwell Prize for Political Fiction and the Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year Award, among other prizes. His 40 or so pieces for the LRB have often, though not always, been on Victorian subjects, and he was last heard talking about Dickens with Rosemary Hill and me on the previous episode of this podcast series. So hello, Tom, and thank you for coming back so soon to talk about Trollope.
Great to be back.
So the novel we're going to be focusing on today is The Last Chronicle of Barset, published in 1867, as the last, as its title suggests, novel in the series set in the fictional county of Barsetshire. You don't have to have read the others first, which is one of the many ways in which Trollope is a generous and considerate author when thinking of his readers, though as I think today's conversation is likely to demonstrate, it's difficult, if not impossible, to talk about one of Trollope's novels in isolation from the others. John Pemble wrote in the LRB a few years ago, paraphrasing Michael Sadler's argument from his 1927 commentary on Trollope, that Trollope was a writer with the rare gift of being able to produce memorable books without writing memorable sentences and probe depths without seeming to move beyond the surface. Do you think that's part of his appeal? How much of his appeal is that? I also think he actually wrote quite a lot of memorable sentences, actually, but
well,
I don't know.
I find myself a bit resistant to that, really. Yes, I'm very much in favour of the idea that the books are memorable, and they are. They really do stay with you. But I think he's a better writer than that altogether gives him credit for. Some of the sentences, I think, are beautifully judged in different ways, and they do stay with you. I think it's very easy because you're so engaged with this wonderful, complex world that Trollope creates in each of the novels, and in the case of the Barsetshire novels in the series, it's very easy to underestimate the skill with which Trollope is creating that world at the level of the sentence in language, and how he draws the reader in to being almost not a co-creator exactly, but a part of the world that he's building. So I don't altogether accept the view that he wasn't a writer who could do that kind of work.
The really amazing thing to me is that he wrote 47 novels, and the quality of them is so unbelievably high. And he wrote them so quickly. But there is such mastery on display there. And I think people are inclined to underrate Trollope or underestimate him, perhaps because he did write so much. And perhaps because he did write so much, people are intimidated or they stop at a certain number of the most famous titles. But I think when you read Trollope in the mass, you can only feel awe. Tolstoy once said of Trollope, he kills me with his excellence. And that's absolutely how I feel, not just as a reader, but as a novelist. I'm just awestruck. In fact, I can't think about it very much because it makes me depressed. But I think he is truly a giant. I think he is one of the great figures of world literature. And if people are sometimes disinclined to make great claims for Trollope, I'm prepared to make the biggest for him. I think he is truly a figure of world significance in literature. And I will go to my grave saying that. And I do challenge people to read him in the mass. And I think your appreciation of his enormous range and enormous skill will overwhelm you too.
Yeah. The books are very memorable, so why this? Well, we had to pick one. Could almost be at random, though it wasn't quite. But why is this a good way into Trollope, Tom?
I mean, maybe it's rather perverse to choose the final novel in a series, but it does act as a summation of so much of what's great about the series, and it does show a lot of what Trollope is good at. I do think, to add to what Dinah was saying, what always strikes me about Trollope is his extraordinary range. Elizabeth Bowen called him the most sheerly able of the Victorian novelists, and that often strikes me as correct, because I think he could do almost anything and do almost anything extremely well. And this novel shows him in a variety of modes, dealing with the different kinds of characters in different kinds of situations, and yet always showing his skill at comedy, at pathos, at social commentary, his mastery of dialogue, his ability to enter a letter writer's voice. I think we can see him doing so many of the things he did well. And I think it's a great place to start. I defy anyone to read this book and not want to read the next 46.
Yeah, so Dinah, perhaps you could tell us where The Last Chronicle of Barset fits into Trollope's life and career and those other 46 novels.
So Trollope was born in 1815, quite an affluent family, but the income didn't match the social standing. His father was a failed barrister with expectations of inheriting a baronetcy, which all came to nothing, also an unsuccessful farmer. So Trollope's childhood, his early years, were marked by disparity between the family's social standing and their income. They were poor, and that caused Trollope a good deal of suffering, particularly as a schoolboy. He was sent to public school, Harrow and Winchester, where he was utterly miserable because he was poor and his schoolfellows were not. He knew what the shame of poverty felt like. He knew that at first hand, and that shows in The Last Chronicle. His mother, Fanny Trollope, was a remarkable woman, tough, resourceful. She did rescue the situation to some extent with her success as a novelist and a travel writer. But those early years were very difficult, and he never forgot them. There was no money for university, so he began to work as a London clerk in post office, where he got into debt. Didn't seem very likely to make a go of things, though he was beginning to grow up and find his feet. His real breakthrough came when he was 26 and landed a post office role in Ireland, which enabled him to make a fresh start, turned out to be good at that job, cleared his debts, found some social success, and found a wife, Rose Heseltine, the daughter of a Yorkshire banker. And the marriage was a happy one. There were 2 sons, and it was in Ireland that he started to write novels. The first 2 novels are set in Ireland. Ireland suited him, and he lived there for 18 years. His early novels were not successful, but he stuck at it, and in 1855 he published The Warden, the first of the 6 Barsetshire novels. We're looking at the last in that series, The Last Chronicle, published in 1867. So the series stretches over 12 years of Trollope's writing life. But I think it's interesting that Trollope didn't at all conceive of himself as writing a series in those early Barsetshire novels, nor did his readers. It was really when he was about halfway through with Framley Parsonage that that enterprise began to be seen in that way, though the connections were always there. They're all set around the fictional cathedral town of Barchester. They're often concerned with the life of the Church of England, though that was never their only concern. The Warden was the first of his books to achieve any critical or financial success. Though it wasn't exactly a resounding hit, the success came quite slowly. It was during that time, while publishing the Barsetshire novels, that Trollope, who wasn't primarily living in England, became a very adventurous traveller. Eventually, he visited Egypt, Palestine, Malta, Gibraltar, the Caribbean, Central America, North America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and just about every country in Europe, either on business on behalf of the post office or on his own account. And he was a travel writer as well as a novelist. I think the important point there is that though it's very easy to think of Trollope as quintessentially an English novelist, there's always part of his imagination that's rooted elsewhere. He does have the perspective of a man who is both insider and outsider. The second series of novels, the Palliser novels, began with Can You Forgive Her?, published in 1865 when he was 50 years old. So published, in fact, before The Last Chronicle was published. The two series do overlap a little. And that was a turning point in Trollope's life. It was in 1867 that he resigned from the post office where he'd been working busily throughout the years of the Barsetshire series in order to concentrate on writing and on editing a literary magazine, St Paul's magazine, which didn't in practice succeed, but did knit him very closely into the literary life of London. And there are 6 Palliser novels, parliamentary novels, as they're sometimes called, centred on the political life of London. It was then that he tried to have a political career of his own. He stood for the constituency of Beverley in Yorkshire in 1868, where he had a thoroughly unhappy experience and was not elected. It made quite a mark on him, and you do see that mark in subsequent novels, the corruption, as he came to see it, of electoral process. But the Palliser novels are like the Barsetshire novels in that they're very wide-ranging in their themes. They're not just political novels. They address the changing position of women, Ireland, marriage, and those are themes that we also see in the Barsetshire novels. And again, it's always the case that Trollope is writing prolifically while those series are appearing. Lots of other novels, had a solid income, substantial house in Waltham Cross, Hertfordshire, had a very active social life, London clubman, loved club life. He was always watching, always thinking, always translating his observations into fiction. He died after a stroke in 1882, and there's a great autobiography published in the year after his death in 1883. It is one of the most interesting literary autobiographies in existence, and it's very well worth reading.
Thank you, Dinah. And so as for what happens in the novel itself, this one of the 47, The Last Chronicle of Barset, Trollope is always very helpful, certainly to readers like me. If you get slightly lost about who you are and who you're with, he will often step in to remind you. So the Trollope Society describes The Last Chronicle of Barset as a congeries of tales of Barsetshire. Tom, perhaps you could untease the threads of the plot for us now?
I'll do my best. It's a huge novel. It's a big and massive and absorbing book with lots of strands, but I will do my best. I think the first thing to say, Dinah's already referred to this, but it is a novel that gathers in lots of characters from the previous books in the series. So you have Mr. Harding, the star of the Warden, playing a role. You have the Grantleys, who are there from the very start, the Prudies, who come from Barchester Towers, Mr. Roberts, Lady Lufton from Framley Parsonage, where Mr. Crawley makes his first appearance. And then we also continue the story of Lily Dale and Johnny Eames from the small house at Allington. So all of these characters are sort of sweeping through the books, pursuing their lives in a way which I think has very interesting fictional consequences and effects, because we do see these characters deepen and their storylines stretch out, and we constantly gain new perspectives on them. And we have almost a series of ironic effects where storylines that have happened in the previous books have kind of mirrorings, or they have ripple effects that we see in the later books. The novel starts with the dominating question of what Mr. Crawley, the Reverend Mr. Crawley, the perpetual curate at Hogglestock, what has he done with a cheque for £20 that he has drawn and paid some debts with but which has been proved not to belong to him at all. So he has used someone else's cheque, drawn someone else's money to pay off his own debts. The novel starts with the question of how he's managed to do this. He doesn't understand how he's managed to do it. He gives false answers about where the cheques come from, how he got hold of it. These explanations are denied. So we start with this problem, mystery. He has effectively stolen money. He can't account for it, and neither can anyone else in the novel as the novel begins. And of course, this is a scandal because he is a priest. He's a man of the cloth, and this is an outrageous thing to happen. So the novel is really dominated by this issue, which is only resolved close to the end of the book. How did he come to spend this money? Mr. Crawley is committed to trial, so he has a trial hanging over his head for most of the novel. So he's not only in moral trouble, he's in legal trouble. He's threatened by all kinds of disaster. And the reason he has all these debts that he was trying to pay off in the first place is because he's very poor. He has an annual income of £130, so this £20 is actually quite significant. And he's being crushed by poverty at the same time as he's being crushed by this criminal charge.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast. Or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.